I have spent many years walking along slopes that seem older than memory, and there is a certain quiet truth I have learned while watching a solitary man make his home among these northern mountains. People imagine that such a life is built on strength or stubbornness, but the truth is that it grows first from a feeling you cannot name, something that rises in your chest like a tide when you finally admit how tired you are of carrying the noise of the world inside your own head. It was this same quiet force that led the man whose story I share today deeper into the high country than he had ever gone before. Long before the snow carved its bright scars across the ridges, and long before he learned to read the wind like a friend. The first time I saw him walking that narrow path, where the spruce trees bend slightly as if listening to the earth, I could sense the weight he carried, but there was something else resting over his shoulders, something closer to clarity than sorrow. It is strange how a person can appear lost and found at the same time, how the lines of his face catch the last gold of afternoon light like a forgotten promise. That is how he looked when I first began to understand the story he now allows me to tell, a story shaped by wind, patience, and the quiet rhythm of survival. He had come to these mountains during a moment of life when people usually fall into routines they pretend are choices. But he stepped away instead, not out of anger or despair, but because something deep inside him whispered that the life he was living had grown tight around him, leaving no room to breathe. The mountains do not call loudly. They speak in the soft scrape of branches in the cold, in the faint drift of cloud shadows across the valley, in the low hum of distant water. Somehow, he heard that call long before he understood what it meant. What he wanted was not escape. It was presence. He did not seek a grand revelation or some dramatic moment of change. He simply wanted to feel life again without rushing through it. And so he chose a place so vast and quiet that he could hear the sound of his own heart without interference. Even now, recalling his early days up here, I can almost feel that first winter settling around him like a second skin. The air sharpened every sense he had. The winds at night carried scents from miles away. The snow taught him to pay attention to details that most people never notice. And slowly, as the weeks folded into months, he began to build a relationship with the land that went far deeper than mere survival. He learned the creaks of the frozen rivers when the temperature dropped so low, his breath seemed to freeze in the air. He learned the slow patterns of the spruce grouse that settled into the low branches. But more than anything, he learned patience, the kind of patience that comes only when you finally stop fighting the rhythm of the world and begin moving with it instead. It was patience that would later allow him to hunt moose in a way many would consider impossible. People think hunting is about weapons or strength or skill, but the truth is that hunting at this level is about listening, listening to wind, listening to the subtle churn of distant hooves, listening to the land itself. The man I speak of had no interest in the common rush that fills the minds of people who hunt for trophies. His interest was in understanding how the moose moved, how they trusted the silence of their world, how they relied on scent more than sight, and how the direction of the wind could mean the difference between survival and disappearance. In time, he learned that the wind was not just a natural force, but a companion that told stories, if one paid attention. It moved across the mountains like a quiet messenger, carrying every scent of the valley with it. If you learned to read those scents, you could feel the presence of animals long before you saw them. In those early seasons, he spent long hours sitting on cold stones at dawn, letting the world settle around him before he made a single decision. He learned to let his breathing fall into rhythm with the forest. He learned that there is no hurry in the mountains. Nothing up here rewards the person who rushes. Every shift of wind across the snow carried a lesson. He once told me that you can learn more about the world by sitting still for an hour than you can by walking for a full day with your mind full of noise. And so he sat, and he listened, and he waited. This waiting became a kind of meditation, a way of living so deeply in the present moment that every sound grew sharper and every movement in the valley felt significant. There was a certain morning that lives in his memory stronger than the rest, the morning when he first understood how wind and patience could bring a moose within reach without him taking a single step. The air was cold enough to make each inhalation sting slightly, the kind of cold that turns snow into fine crystals that crunch softly under weight. The sky had not yet gained its full light. Only a faint blue glow rested across the peaks. He could smell spruce resin, distant water, and the faint musk of something large moving far beyond sight. He did not move. He did not lean forward. He simply listened. The wind carried the scent of the moose from the north, drifting gently toward him, and he let the scent tell its story. He knew the animal was calm, unthreatened, unaware. He knew it was grazing slowly near the edge of a frozen marsh. And because he understood the way the land curled around that marsh, he knew exactly where the animal would walk as it shifted toward thicker cover. What he did next was nothing. That was his technique. He did not stalk. He did not push forward. He did not try to control the situation. He simply stayed still in a position where the wind carried the scent to him, but carried none of his scent back. The moose eventually walked right past him, not because he hid or chased it, but because he allowed the world to move naturally while he moved with it. When finally he rose and approached, it was with gratitude and respect, not with triumph. He believed deeply that survival was a partnership, not a conquest. That morning became the quiet proof that patience and wind were enough. When I share this introduction with you, I do not do so to create some myth of a superhuman or a rugged legend. I do it because I know many people feel a similar pull toward peace, yet fear the idea of being alone or stepping away from what others expect. This man's life reminds us that peace does not come from dramatic choices. It comes from listening more closely to what you already feel inside. The mountains simply amplified the voice he had ignored for too long. Perhaps you have felt something similar. Perhaps there is a part of you that longs for silence, not as an escape, but as a return to something genuine. Perhaps you have wondered what might change if you allowed yourself even a moment of stillness. If so, then you already understand the beginning of his story more deeply than you realize. And before we follow him further into this life shaped by wind, solitude, and understanding, I would like to know something simple that connects us across distance. As you listen to this story and imagine the cold air moving across these northern ridges, tell me where you are watching from. It is always a comfort to know from which corner of the world these mountains are being heard. He had not always been a man of silence. before the mountain claimed his attention and the wind began to teach him its quiet language. He had lived in a world that thrived on noise, speed, and constant conversation. He once worked among people who believed that the value of a day could be measured by how many tasks were completed, how many calls were made, how much progress could be proven with numbers. He was good at it, too, better than most, and for many years that skill was enough to make him believe he was living well. But beneath the surface of his achievements, there was a growing emptiness he could not name. It began with small moments, a forgotten conversation with a friend, a morning when he could not remember why he was rushing, a night when the lights of the city no longer felt warm but hollow. Each of these moments was a quiet warning, and yet he ignored them. He told himself that this was what life was supposed to be, that contentment would come eventually, that he only needed to work harder or buy more or wait longer. But waiting never brought peace. It only deepened the silence inside him, a silence that no conversation could fill. There was a particular winter that marked the turning point. He had taken a short trip north with a friend who loved hunting, though he himself had never been interested. They traveled out to the edge of a frozen lake surrounded by black spruce and deep snow, where the air moved differently, slower, heavier, as if it carried the weight of the earth itself. On that first evening, when the sun fell and the frost began to climb up the tent walls, something inside him changed. He realized how far he had drifted from anything that felt alive. The stillness frightened him at first because it revealed how empty his thoughts had become, but it also soothed him in a way he could not explain. That night, as he lay awake listening to the wind scrape across the frozen lake, he understood that this sound was truer than any voice he had heard in years. It spoke without demanding, and that was enough. When he returned to the city, he felt like a stranger in his own life. The faces of people he once loved seemed blurred by distraction, as though they were all pretending not to be lost. Conversations felt like echoes of something that had already died. He began spending more time alone, walking along the river after dark, listening to the wind move through the bare branches, and thinking about the feeling he had found in that far northern silence. Over the next year, he sold nearly everything he owned. Friends called him reckless. Some thought he was sick or lonely, but he wasn't lonely. He was tired of pretending that noise meant connection. He wanted to learn what it meant to be awake again. His decision to move into the mountains was not sudden. It unfolded like the slow melt of spring ice. He studied maps, spoke to trappers, read journals of old explorers who lived off the land before roads reached this far north. Eventually, he found a valley that felt right, a wide basin of spruce and birch, bordered by jagged peaks that caught the morning light long before the rest of the world woke. There was a small cabin there, abandoned by a hunter years before, with half a roof and a stove still rusting in the corner. He rebuilt it slowly, carrying each piece of timber by hand, guided by patience rather than haste. It was during those long days of building that he learned the first rule of the mountain. Nothing strong comes quickly. Every beam that resisted him, every nail that bent, every fire that refused to start became a teacher. He carried very little from his old life into this new one. A few tools, some books on weather and tracking, a knife his father had given him, and a single photograph of his mother standing by a river in summer sunlight. Everything else he left behind, including the name people used to call him. Here, among the ridges and the quiet snowfields, he was simply another creature trying to survive with grace. The first months were harder than he expected. The isolation stripped away every illusion of comfort. He learned that hunger has its own voice and that cold tests more than just the body. But he also discovered that solitude does not mean emptiness. It is simply a space where truth becomes impossible to avoid. Each day he woke before dawn, lit the fire, and stepped outside to breathe in the freezing air. He could smell the resin of spruce, the faint sweetness of birch bark burning, and sometimes the musky trace of moose moving through the valley. He began keeping a small journal, not to record events, but to measure changes in himself. On one of the first pages he wrote, "I am beginning to hear the difference between silence and stillness." That line would guide him for the rest of his life. As the seasons turned, he learned the slow rhythm of the land. He learned how to read animal tracks after snow, how to know which direction a storm would come from by watching the flight of crows, and how to listen to the ground before walking across it. The wind became his language. Some days it whispered gently through the valley, carrying the scent of thawing earth. Other days it roared down from the peaks with the weight of ice and distance. In time, he could tell the mood of the mountain simply by feeling how the air moved against his skin. And yet, even as he grew comfortable in solitude, there were nights when memories returned with painful clarity. He would sit by the fire, watching the sparks rise into darkness, and recall the faces of those he had left behind. He thought about the woman he once loved who had asked him before he left if he was running from something. He had told her no, but the truth was more complicated. He wasn't running from life. He was running toward a version of it that still felt real. The world he left behind was full of mirrors, reflections of what people wanted to appear as, not what they were. Here, there were no mirrors. The mountain showed him only what he was willing to face. That second winter was when he finally began to feel peace rather than endurance. He stopped counting days. The rhythms of the sun and the stars became his only calendar. Sometimes he went weeks without speaking a word, yet he never felt mute. His communication came through movement, through chopping wood, tracking snow, watching the slow passage of clouds. Every act became a kind of prayer. When he hunted, it was never for sport. He believed that taking life demanded respect and necessity. He would kneel beside the animal afterward, lay his hand over its heart, and whisper gratitude. To him, that was sacred. It was the same reverence he later applied to the moose, whose presence came to define his relationship with patience and the wind. There was a small circle of hunters who occasionally crossed through his valley, and though he rarely joined them, he listened to their stories when they stopped by his cabin for coffee. Most of them spoke about their hunts in terms of luck or weapons, always eager to describe the power of the rifle, the distance of the shot, the weight of the antlers. But he would remain quiet, stirring the fire, letting them speak while he studied how they carried themselves. He realized that many of them hunted for proof, for something to show, for a sense of mastery over nature. He wanted none of that. What he sought was understanding, and understanding could not be rushed or measured. It had to be earned through patience. He began experimenting with what he called wind walking. He would spend entire days following the direction of the wind, never moving against it, learning how scent traveled, how it curled around ridges and through trees. He noted how moose responded when they caught even the faintest trace of human presence, how their ears flicked, how their bodies tensed before vanishing into the forest. Slowly, through hundreds of such observations, he discovered the art of becoming invisible, not by hiding, but by belonging. He learned that if you align yourself with the rhythm of the land, if you let your heartbeat match the pace of the wilderness, the animals no longer see you as foreign. The wind carries your scent in ways that do not betray you, and patience does the rest. By the time the third year came, the valley no longer felt like a place he lived in, but like a being he lived with. He no longer measured success by how much he gathered or how comfortable he was. Success meant harmony, balance, and awareness. Sometimes he would spend hours sitting by the edge of a frozen stream, watching how the water moved under the ice. Other times he would climb high into the ridges just to feel the wind strike his face, to remind himself that he was still part of something larger and untamed. And in those moments, when he stood alone beneath the wide sky, he often felt a sense of connection stronger than any he had known among people. That was the past that shaped him, the reason he chose isolation not as retreat, but as renewal. Every memory that had once felt heavy now became light enough to carry. Every regret lost its edge, and every day spent in silence taught him more about being alive than all the years of noise before. It is strange how solitude can cleanse a person until only truth remains. He had found that truth here among the spruce, the snow, and the slow breath of the wind. And as his story deepens, I invite you, if this quiet journey speaks to you, to stay close and follow his path. Subscribe, as they say, not just to the story, but to the silence that lives beneath it, to the lessons the wind still whispers for those willing to listen. The seasons in the north are not measured by months, but by the tone of the light and the sound of the wind through the trees. When summer comes, it does not announce itself with sudden heat, but with a subtle shift in how the air moves through the valleys, a softness that carries the scent of earth instead of frost. For the man in the mountains, these changes became his only calendar, and the silence around him became a form of language. There were mornings when he woke before dawn and sat outside, his back resting against the rough wall of the cabin, just listening. Sometimes he would hear the first bird of the season, a lone cry breaking through the fog. Other times, nothing moved at all except the slow swirl of mist rising from the thawing river. Those were the moments he understood best why he had chosen this life. For in that stillness there was no urgency, no competition, no demand to be anyone other than what he already was. Over the years, he built a quiet rhythm that guided his days. When the sun rose, he worked, cutting wood, checking his traps, repairing the cabin roof, cleaning tools worn by time. When the day reached its high point, he would rest and observe. He called this his listening hour, a time when he did nothing except watch the light move across the valley. It may seem simple, but it was during these quiet hours that he began to see the world as it truly was, without the distortion of haste. He noticed how the mountain breathed differently with each season, how the wind spoke through the pines in summer, but through bare branches in winter, and how Even silence had layers if you listened closely enough. Some days he would hear the distant rumble of falling ice, the echo rolling through the valley like thunder. Other days he would hear the faint crunch of hooves on frozen ground. Each sound carried meaning, and he learned to read those meanings as others read words. There were times when loneliness drifted into his thoughts like fog creeping down from the peaks. But even then, he did not see it as a punishment. It was a mirror, showing him where he still clung to the need for others to define him. He remembered the old life he had left, the endless messages, the faces of people who spoke without truly listening, the feeling of always being surrounded yet unseen. Compared to that, the solitude here was pure. It demanded honesty. When he felt sadness, he did not resist it. He let it pass through him like weather. When he felt joy, he did not cling to it. He simply allowed it to exist. The mountain had taught him that emotions, like storms, are temporary, and peace lies in letting them come and go without fear. He began keeping small markers throughout the valley, things only he would recognize. A carved symbol on a spruce trunk where he once saw a wolf in the snow, a stone placed by the stream to mark the first day he heard spring water running again after winter, a strip of bark tied near the ridge to remember where he had once waited for hours watching the wind turn. These became his calendar of memory, not of time, but of presence. Each mark was a reminder that he was still here, still learning, still part of this great breathing landscape. Food was never abundant, but it was enough. He learned to live on less than he once thought possible. Moose meat, when he was lucky enough to earn it, provided sustenance for weeks. Fish from the river gave variety. Berries and herbs from the meadows filled in the rest. Everything was taken with care and respect. He wasted nothing, not even the smallest bone or strip of sinew. He often said that waste was the language of people who had forgotten gratitude. Here, gratitude was survival itself. Every meal carried a sense of wonder, as if the land had granted him permission to stay another day. His days of silence were broken only by the natural sounds of the valley, the whistle of wind through the cabin cracks, the occasional howl of a distant wolf, the steady pulse of water beneath ice. Sometimes, on rare days, a plane would cross far overhead, a thin silver line against the sky. He would watch it until it vanished, thinking of how small and hurried that world must feel from up there. It no longer felt like a world he belonged to. The mountain had stripped him of the need for constant movement. Here, stillness was not stagnation, but a form of deep motion, the kind that happens within the soul, rather than across distances. There were evenings when the northern lights would rise over the peaks, painting the snow in green and violet waves. He would stand for hours under that trembling sky, feeling something ancient stir inside him. It was as though the world was speaking directly, without words, reminding him that beauty does not need witnesses to exist. Those lights appeared with no audience, no applause, no purpose other than to be themselves. That realization softened something in him. He began to see his own solitude as part of that same truth, a quiet life that did not need validation to be meaningful. Over time, he noticed that the animals of the valley no longer fled at his presence. The foxes moved near his traps without fear. The birds returned to perch close to the cabin window. Once, a young moose wandered right up to the clearing where he was chopping wood, sniffed the air, and stood watching him for nearly a full minute before walking away. He took it as a sign that he had finally become part of the rhythm rather than an interruption. He was no longer a visitor in the mountains world, but a participant in its ongoing conversation. He often said that silence is not the absence of sound, but the fullness of attention. In the modern world, he had been surrounded by noise, yet never heard anything. Here, he could hear the subtle language of the wind shifting before a storm or the faint sound of snow settling on itself after a heavy fall. He began to measure time not by clocks, but by temperature, shadow, and instinct. Some days he would sit beside the fire and realize that hours had passed without him noticing. The fire burned low, and he felt no urge to move, no thought of lost time. That was freedom, the absence of the need to measure life at all. In those moments of deep quiet, his mind became clearer than it had ever been. He began to think about the people he once knew and how they lived surrounded by constant noise and distraction. He wondered how many of them truly saw the sky or noticed the way the wind changes direction at sunset. He realized that most people spend their lives trying to fill silence rather than understand it. They fear what it might reveal, but he no longer feared silence. It had become his companion, his teacher, his proof that he was still alive. Sometimes he would write small reflections in his journal, simple sentences that captured what he learned each day. "The wind knows before the trees," he wrote once. "Another day. Stillness is not waiting. It is living." These short lines became like prayers to him, reminders that truth often hides in simplicity. He never intended for anyone to read them, yet in their quiet honesty, they carried a wisdom deeper than any book he had read in his old life. As the years passed, the mountain gave him everything he needed: food, shelter, purpose, and peace. But what it gave most profoundly was understanding. He came to see that the world's noise had not been made by machines or cities alone. It had come from within people, from their refusal to be still, from their fear of themselves. Up here, stripped of all distractions, he faced himself every day. There was no escape from his own thoughts, no one to blame, no place to hide. And in that confrontation, he found liberation. He realized that most suffering comes not from circumstance, but from resistance, and that the moment you stop resisting life, even hardship becomes beautiful. The silence of the mountain became his mirror, and in it he saw what he truly was: small, temporary, and yet completely part of the vastness around him. He no longer sought meaning, he lived it. Each sunrise was enough. Each snowfall was a gift. Each sound of wind through the trees was a reminder that he belonged here, among things that asked for nothing and gave everything. He often said, if anyone had asked him, that solitude was not loneliness, but clarity. The moment you finally hear life without the echo of other voices. And it is in this deep, enduring silence that we find him now, living not as an exile from the world, but as someone who finally learned to listen. He has become fluent in the language of stillness, a man defined not by what he does, but by how deeply he exists. The mountain has accepted him, and in return he has learned the art of simply being. The fourth winter came with a kind of quiet the man had never experienced before. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of fullness, as though every breath of wind carried memory, and every tree stood watch with purpose. The snow fell heavier than in years past, blanketing the valley until all movement slowed to the rhythm of necessity. Days were short, the sun appearing only briefly before vanishing behind the peaks, leaving a pale blue twilight that stretched for hours. During that winter, he faced a challenge that would become both a trial and a revelation, the kind of test that separates those who merely live in the wilderness from those who belong to it. It began with hunger, as many lessons do, and ended with understanding deeper than survival itself. He had rationed his food carefully, but by late January, supplies began to dwindle faster than expected. The fish traps yielded little. The smaller game had grown scarce. The snow was too deep for easy travel, and the cold too sharp for mistakes. He had enough wood to last, but food was another matter. For days he stretched what little remained of dried meat and flour, eating sparingly, watching the fire burn lower each night. Hunger, he would later say, has a way of sharpening not only the body, but the soul. It strips away every illusion of comfort and forces you to face what you truly are when nothing comes easily. It was in that state, lean, watchful, and still, that he turned again to the moose, the one animal large enough to sustain him through the deep cold if he could earn it. He knew the moose moved along the low valley near the marshes even in winter, where the willows stayed exposed despite the snow. They were cautious creatures, guided almost entirely by scent and wind. You could not chase them, for they would vanish long before you came close. You could not outsmart them, because they were older than cleverness itself. The only way to meet one was to wait, to become part of the land until it no longer saw you as a threat. That was his gift now, the ability to disappear without hiding. The lesson had taken years to learn, but now it would be tested in full. He prepared for 3 days before setting out, gathering what little strength he had left. He packed only what was necessary, a small knife, his old rifle with a single round he hoped not to use, and a strip of frozen meat to keep him steady. Before dawn, he left the cabin and moved toward the valley floor, following the faint silver of moonlight across the snow. His breath formed small clouds that drifted upward, catching the stars. The air was so cold it felt as though even sound had frozen. His steps made soft crunches that echoed into nothingness. The mountain slept around him. When he reached the edge of the marsh, he stopped and listened. The first rule of the hunt was always the same: move only when the wind allows it. That morning it came from the north, steady and calm. He crouched low, testing its direction by letting a pinch of snow fall from his hand. The flakes drifted gently away from him, confirming what he hoped. The wind would carry the scent of the moose toward him, not the other way. He moved to a cluster of trees where the snow lay deeper and waited. He did not call or move again. He simply stood still, letting time dissolve around him. Hours passed in silence. The light shifted slowly from blue to gray to the faint gold of morning. His legs stiffened. His breath grew shallow, yet he did not stir. The cold had become part of him now. He had long since learned that endurance is not strength, but surrender. When you stop fighting the cold, it no longer hurts. It simply is. In that stillness, he began to feel the land itself breathing. He heard the faint creak of frozen branches, the distant rush of a raven's wings, and then, far away, the deep, slow crunch of hooves breaking through crusted snow. He froze, listening. The sound came again, rhythmic, deliberate, unhurried. A moose was moving through the marsh, just as he had hoped. He did not reach for the rifle. He did not move at all. He only turned his head slightly, watching the tree line. Soon he saw it. A shadow at first, then the unmistakable shape of a great bull moose stepping into the open. Steam rose from its nostrils as it breathed. Its coat was dark and thick, almost black against the snow, and the antlers looked like the crown of some ancient creature from a forgotten world. It stopped, sniffing the air. The wind still held steady, carrying its scent toward him. The man could feel his pulse, but it was not excitement. It was reverence. He knew this was no mere hunt. It was a conversation between life and necessity. Minutes stretched like hours. The moose began to move again, slow and deliberate, each step sinking into the snow. It walked closer, unaware, trusting the wind as all wild things must. When it reached the edge of the clearing, no more than 30 yards away, the man finally raised his head. He looked at the animal and knew that if he took the shot, it would not be an act of conquest, but of balance. Yet something within him hesitated. In that moment of perfect silence, he realized that survival was not about taking life, but about understanding the cost of it. The mountain had given him everything: shelter, water, peace. And now it offered him this test. Would he take only what he needed, or would he reach for more simply because he could? He lowered the rifle. Instead of shooting, he waited, letting the wind carry his scent at last. The moose lifted its head, turned slightly, and met his gaze. For a heartbeat, they stood facing each other, two living beings bound by the same law of existence. Then, with a slow turn of its neck, the moose walked away into the deeper forest, vanishing between the trees as if it had never been there. The man remained still long after it disappeared, the cold seeping into his bones, his hunger unchanged, but his heart full. He had faced the choice and understood the truth. Patience and restraint were stronger than hunger, stronger than fear, stronger even than death itself. That day he returned to the cabin empty-handed, but not defeated. The hunger remained, yet so did a deep sense of peace. He found small game over the following days, enough to survive, enough to remind him that the mountain always provides, though never in the way you expect. When he finally ate that night, he felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He understood that the moose had not escaped him. It had taught him. It had shown him that patience is not the art of waiting, but the art of trusting. The belief that what you need will come when you are ready to receive it. As winter slowly loosened its grip, he found himself walking more often to that same marsh. He would sit in the same place and watch the wind ripple through the willows. Sometimes he saw the moose again, always at a distance, always calm. He began to feel as though they shared an unspoken understanding, a quiet agreement between two survivors of the same world. He realized that he no longer needed to hunt to feel connected to the land. Simply being part of it was enough. That discovery marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life on the mountain. He stopped measuring success by what he caught or gathered. Instead, he began to live by awareness. He watched how the snow melted faster on the south-facing slopes, how the first green shoots appeared in the meadows long before the ice left the river, how the ravens changed their flight paths before storms. Everything became a lesson. He began carving small wooden figures at night, shapes inspired by the animals he encountered, the moose, the fox, the owl. Each carving held a memory, a fragment of understanding. He did not sell or trade them. He simply placed them around his cabin, reminders of what the mountain had taught him. As spring came, he felt a new energy rising within him, not the restless kind that once pushed him through city streets, but the calm strength that comes from harmony. He had learned to live with the mountain, not against it. The wind that once chilled him now guided him. The patience that once felt heavy now set him free. He often said to himself, in those quiet evenings beside the fire, that a man becomes truly alive only when he learns to stop chasing life and starts listening to it instead. And so the lesson of that long, cold hunt became a story he would carry forever, a story of wind, hunger, and patience. It was the moment he stopped surviving and began belonging. If this part of his journey speaks to you, stay close to the story. Follow it as you would follow a trail through snow, and subscribe so you don't miss the next whisper of wind that carries his truth further down the mountain. He often said that the longer a man lives among mountains, the more he begins to see through the layers of the world, like lifting thin veils one by one until only the essential remains. Years passed, though he no longer counted them. The seasons turned like the slow breathing of a giant, and he moved within their rhythm, no longer an observer, but a participant in their ancient conversation. His beard grew white and soft as snow, his hands rough as the bark of the trees he leaned against, and his voice grew quiet, as if afraid to disturb the peace that surrounded him. The days no longer demanded meaning, yet each one revealed more truth than all the years before. It was in these later years that his thoughts began to drift inward, toward the question that had always lingered behind his solitude, the question of what it meant to be human in a world that asks for nothing and yet gives everything. He had once believed that the world was divided between the civilized and the wild, between the human and the natural. But over time, that division faded until it no longer made sense. The same wind that carried scent for the moose carried breath for him. The same water that filled the streams moved through his own veins. He came to see that the line between man and nature was not real. It was a trick of memory, a story humans told themselves to feel separate. The mountain had never seen him as different, only as one more creature learning how to listen. This realization changed the way he saw everything. The world was not a collection of things, but a single living presence, vast and unbroken, where even silence had purpose. And within that great stillness, he found himself again, not the man he had been, but the one he was always meant to become. He began to reflect often during his long walks, not in words but in feelings, in quiet observations that sank into him like roots into thawed soil. He would pause to watch the slow drift of clouds across the peaks, thinking how each one carried both shadow and light. He realized that people are the same, always moving between moments of clarity and confusion, never one thing entirely. He understood that suffering was not an error in the human design, but a teacher, a reminder that life is not meant to be comfortable, but complete. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, these were not punishments, but invitations to return to what was real. And what was real was always simple. The breath in his lungs, the weight of the axe in his hand, the distant call of a bird disappearing into mist. These were enough. They were always enough. Some nights, as the fire crackled low, he would think about the world he left behind. He wondered if those who had once known him were still chasing their reflections in glass towers and screens. He thought about how strange it was that people built entire cities to escape the discomfort of stillness, only to fill those cities with noise that kept them from hearing themselves. He realized that the world had not changed, only his distance from it had. What once looked like progress now looked like distraction. What once felt like connection now seemed like confusion. He pitied no one, for he understood that everyone has their own mountain to climb, even if it is made of noise instead of stone. But he hoped quietly that more people would someday learn to stop and listen, not to him, but to the wind, to the silence, to their own heartbeat when the world finally grows quiet enough to hear it. His reflections deepened each year, and he began to see patterns everywhere. The fall of a leaf became a lesson in letting go. The steady growth of moss along a rock became a lesson in patience. The return of the birds each spring reminded him that nothing truly ends. It only changes form. He came to see death, not as an ending, but as another breath in the life of the mountain, another shift in the endless cycle of becoming. Once, when he found the bones of a fox in the snow, he buried them beneath a birch and whispered a simple thanks. He no longer saw death as tragedy. It was simply part of the conversation, one voice growing quiet so that another could begin. He also began to think about time differently. In the city, time had been something to be managed, controlled, feared. Here, it flowed without edges. He stopped marking days entirely. He lived instead by sensation, by the warmth of sunlight, by the angle of shadow, by the smell of rain. He said once, to no one but the wind, that time is not passing, it is standing still, and we are the ones moving through it. Each moment became complete in itself, needing nothing more. Even the smallest gesture, lighting a fire, mending a tool, watching snow fall, held a depth that words could not express. When you live close to the earth, he said, you begin to realize that every act is sacred, even the simple act of breathing. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to himself, but to the world around him. He would say good morning to the mountain, thank the river for its patience, and apologize to the trees when he took their wood. These small rituals were his prayers, though he no longer believed in the kind of God people argued about. For him, the divine was everywhere, in the crack of ice on a frozen pond, in the sigh of wind through pine needles, in the still eyes of the moose that watched him from afar. He did not need faith to believe in it. He could feel it in the rhythm of his own pulse. That was enough. He once wrote in his journal, "Perhaps God is not above us, but within all things that remain quiet long enough to listen." That sentence stayed with him for the rest of his life. During these years, visitors came only rarely. Sometimes a trapper would pass through, or a lost hiker would stumble upon his cabin, drawn by the thin column of smoke rising into the sky. He never turned anyone away. He would offer warmth, food, and silence. Most of them talked too much at first, filling the quiet with stories of the world beyond. But after a while, they would fall silent too, as if the mountain itself had taken their words away. He watched this happen again and again, the same realization spreading through their faces when they noticed how different silence felt up here. Some left changed, others only unsettled, but all of them left quieter than they arrived. One winter, a young man stayed with him for several weeks after losing his way in the storm. The young man was restless, full of the energy of youth, always questioning, always asking why someone would choose to live alone like this. The old man listened patiently and answered only when necessary. One night, as they sat by the fire, the young man asked, "Don't you ever get lonely?" The old man looked into the flames for a long time before replying, "Loneliness is the absence of yourself, not the absence of others." The young man did not understand at first, but years later he would. That sentence would become a quiet seed in his memory, something that would grow only when the noise of life finally faded. In these reflections, the man began to understand something essential, that peace is not a gift from the world, but a discipline of perception. The mountain had not changed for him. He had changed for the mountain. Everything he once sought, meaning, purpose, belonging, had been here all along, waiting beneath the noise. It was never hidden, only ignored. That realization filled him with a gratitude so deep it felt like humility. He no longer needed to prove anything, not even to himself. He had become part of the rhythm, part of the silence, part of the infinite patience of the land. And so, as the years folded into one another, he lived in quiet reflection, content to let the world move as it would. He knew now that truth was not something to be found, but something to be remembered. It was in the wind, in the snow, in the stillness between heartbeats. It was everywhere, waiting for those who stopped long enough to see it. If the rhythm of his thought speaks to you, if his reflection stirs something familiar inside you, stay close to the story. Subscribe, as the world calls it, and walk with him a little farther into the silence that teaches more than words ever could. The last years of his life came quietly, as all true endings do. There was no sudden decline, no great tragedy, no sense of loss or urgency. The mountain, faithful and patient, simply began to fold him into itself, the way snow folds into rivers when spring returns. He had grown slower in his movements, but his eyes remained clear, the color of deep water under shade. Each morning he still rose before the sun, not from duty, but from habit, stepping outside to greet the dawn no matter the season. The cold no longer bit him. It was part of him, as familiar as breath. He would stand there, hands resting on the rail of the old porch, and listen to the wind sweeping down the slopes, carrying the same voice that had once guided him to a moose in winter long ago. That voice never stopped speaking, and he never stopped listening. By then his cabin had aged with him. The wood darkened by smoke and time, the small windows clouded with frost and dust. Inside, everything had a purpose. Each tool hung in its place. Each log on the floor told a story of a night survived. A fire kept burning. The carvings he had made, those small wooden figures of animals and trees, stood lined on the mantel like quiet guardians, reminders of the lessons that shaped him. The journal he had kept for years had grown thick, its pages filled not with events, but with understanding. There were no dates, only reflections, lines written in the dim light of morning. The mountain is patient with those who listen. The wind forgives without question. To live is to wait without fear. They were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to be lived. Sometimes when he walked to the ridge at dusk, he would look down at the valley and think about all that had changed and all that had not. The same ridges still caught the first light of morning. The same river still curved like a silver thread through the spruce. The same moose still moved through the willows, cautious and slow. Yet he could feel that the world beyond had grown louder, more frantic. He sensed it in the plains that now crossed the sky more often, in the distant hum that sometimes drifted from far below, where people still built and hurried and forgot. He no longer judged them. He understood now that everyone seeks peace in their own way, even if they must lose themselves first to find it. His choice had simply been different. He had chosen silence not to escape the world, but to understand it. There were no more great hunts, no more tests of endurance. His body, though strong, asked for rest. He spent his days tending the small garden he had grown beside the cabin, a patch of green stubborn enough to survive the northern soil. He grew herbs, a few hardy roots, and sometimes a thin line of beans that clung to the last warmth of summer. These small acts gave him joy, not because they made life easier, but because they reminded him that creation continues even in solitude. He often said that tending a garden was no different from tending the soul. You do not force it to grow, you simply make space for it, protect it from harm, and let the sun do the rest. At night, when the sky cleared and the stars burned fiercely above the peaks, he would sit outside wrapped in a thick coat, the fire crackling beside him. The air smelled of pine and smoke and the faint sweetness of thawing sap. In those hours, he would think about his life not as a story, but as a single, continuous breath. He saw how every decision, every mistake, every moment of hunger or peace had led to this stillness. He did not see regret anywhere. The mountain had taken his fears long ago, ground them down into patience, and left only gratitude in their place. Sometimes he wondered what people might think of him if they knew he had lived so many years alone. Would they call it courage or madness? He decided it was neither. It was simply the natural conclusion of a heart that had grown tired of noise and found peace in listening. He had long since stopped writing letters or leaving messages for the world. But one winter evening, as snow fell quietly against the windows, he opened his journal and wrote a final entry. The candle flickered beside him, the flame small but steady. His handwriting had grown rough, yet the words came clear. If someone should find this, know that I was not alone. The mountain is never empty. The wind is never silent. If you listen long enough, you will hear what I heard, that life is not meant to be conquered, only understood. He closed the book and placed it back on the shelf between the wooden figures and his small stone he had carried for years from the riverbed. Then he went to sleep as he always did, without fear, trusting that morning would decide what came next. The following spring, when the snow melted and the first green began to return, a group of trappers passed through the valley and found his cabin. The door was half open, the fire long out, and everything inside left in perfect order. They said it felt as though he had simply stepped outside and vanished into the trees. On the table lay the journal, the last page still open, and a cup beside it, empty, but clean. They buried him not far from the cabin, near the birch tree that had shaded him in summer, and marked the place with a stone carved with the shape of a moose. They said the valley felt different after that, as if the silence had grown deeper, kinder, as though it remembered him. But his story did not end there, for stories like his never really end. They continue in the wind that moves through the ridges, in the snow that falls without witness, in the quiet courage of those who seek something beyond noise. Sometimes travelers passing through the valley claim they feel a strange peace there, as if watched over by something unseen. Some even say they have seen a figure at dusk, standing by the edge of the marsh, still and patient, as though waiting for the wind to shift. They say it looks like a man listening, but not for sound. Listening for the memory of a life lived in complete understanding. His legacy was not built on what he left behind, but on what he became. A reminder that solitude, when chosen with love, is not emptiness, but fulfillment. That peace is not the absence of struggle, but the acceptance of it. That patience is not waiting, but trusting. And that silence, when truly embraced, does not erase the world, but reveals it. He had found in the mountains what so few ever do, the harmony between being and belonging. His body returned to the earth, but his presence remained as constant as the wind he once followed, as patient as the snow that falls year after year without asking to be seen. And so, if you ever find yourself standing on a high ridge with the cold air brushing your face and the silence pressing close around you, remember his story. Remember that peace does not live in places, but in people. That what you seek is already within you, waiting for the noise to fade. And when the wind rises, listen. It carries the voice of the man who once hunted moose with nothing but patience and faith in the invisible paths of air, a man who learned that all of life is a conversation between what is fleeting and what endures. If this story touched you, if you felt the mountain's breath through these words, let it continue its quiet journey. Leave a sign of where you listened from. Share it with someone who might need its calm, and let it remind others that silence, patience, and presence are still possible in a world that has forgotten how to hear. Like the man in the mountains, all we truly need to begin again is wind, patience, and a willing heart.